Hello everybody and welcome back to the Garibaldi Red podcast, a Nottingham Forest podcast. I'm Max Sayes, your host, and as we continue pre-season and the Forest players are sunning it up in lovely Spain somewhere ready for their pre-season games, we thought we'd do a bit of a Forest Q&A. We haven't done one in a couple of weeks and there's lots to discuss as always with Forest. It's never a dull moment. It's first of all Reds fan from Australia, regular to the podcast, David Boldeman. David, good to see you. How are you?
G'day, Max. Terrific to see you as well. I just love that Nottingham Forest have adopted the Australian training kit with the new beautiful green and yellow kits that we've seen them going with. I even changed my display where I put an Australian jersey up just to celebrate the new Nottingham Forest green and yellow. But please stay in the Garibaldi Red.
Also joining us hot off the plane, really. He's come from Germany. He's been following the Euros from an England fan point of view, is Steve Bennet. Steve, good to see you. How were the Euros? You were at the final as well. I mean, what an experience. Just such a shame England couldn't get over the line.
Yeah, thanks, Max. Good to see you as ever. It was fantastic. I mean, I just love that experience of tournament football. I mean, I think, as you know, I went out for the group games at the beginning, came back home, and then went back out for the semi-final and the final. That Ollie Watkins goal in Dortmund on the, whatever it was, 89th, 90th minute was just a wonderful experience right up there. The final was ultimately disappointing. Personally, I'm disappointed that Gareth has gone. I think he's probably not got the respect and credit he fully deserves, but I think in time that will happen. And now it's all about planning for Canada, the US and Mexico in 2026.
Let's start with some questions. And we will start with some that we got on Twitter, or X as people call it now. And we'll start with this one. On X, Lucy asks, what position would you be strengthening in this summer? Obviously, Forest have been already quite busy in the market, but there's probably a bit more action to happen. It's Forest. We'll probably go and sign 20 more players before the end of the window, but Forest have been linked with many. Steve, start with you actually. Which position would you be going for this summer if you were part of the Forest recruitment team? An urgent one, maybe?
So I think there's two positions that we've not yet dealt with. One is, I think we desperately need another striker. And actually, that would be my priority, because I think it's really important to get somebody in and get them into pre-season. Obviously, as reported, there's a personal issue with Taiwo, which is why he's not in Spain. But, he's fit, but not going to take part in pre-season again. And that's going to be a problem, because then we're left with Chris Wood and, maybe some youngsters, and then doing it on the wings. So I think another striker is absolutely crucial. Another really fast, pacey winger to support Hudson-Odoi and Elanga. They both had great seasons last year. Elanga started well, plateaued. Hudson-Odoi wasn't, comfortable at the start, but it just shows that you give a player lots of games and lots of game time, and then he starts to flourish. So I'm really excited about both of them for next season. But I think we need some support in that area, just in case one of them gets injured, takes a knock, has a couple of weeks out of form, that sort of thing. So those are the two areas I would prioritise now.
I'm reviewing the 25 spot squads, and if you go 3 goalkeepers, 8 defenders, 8 midfielders and 6 forward wingers, or maybe 7 and 7, the defenders look like it's pretty short up. There's maybe 1 spot free. The goalkeepers, there's still a question mark around what happens with Turner. But certainly up front, I was thinking about it while Steve was answering. If Chris Wood and Taiwo Awoniyi were guaranteed uninjured seasons, and so we had both of them fit for the entire season, would you still want a striker to sign then? And I think the answer to that is still yes.
Yeah.
And so given that that's the case, I just hope that we don't end up with a Divock Origi style player again. I was worried a couple of weeks ago on the pod with you, Max. I said we'd end up signing 15 players. It just seems a far more measured approach to the signings this season. A far more mature, understanding what it's like to be a Premier League team, and we just don't seem to have the panic around us. So I'm back in Forest in. We'll get the right players.
Yeah, you lead me quite nicely onto one of the next questions that's just come in. Billy asks on X, Forest showing signs of a stable club off the pitch this summer? Well, I think you've just kind of answered that, David.
Just on that, I was just watching the Forest summer video that they put out. And I think there's kind of two parts to think about the summer training video is what they're trying to tell in terms of a story when they put up those social videos. It's not like just they film a bit of stuff and the video producer just puts out what they want. They are clearly telling us and wanting to tell us that they are a more united team, and you can tell by the way that they've got the chanting for the team that won, the high fives, and the way that they're kind of acting together as a team. And you can just tell that, look, I don't think they could BS us if that wasn't real, that story of the togetherness, and you can see the players that are together. So I'm feeling really good about it. But yeah, Steve, are you feeling the same? Are you getting the same positive vibes on the ground in Nottingham that I am?
Yeah, I mean, I think I hesitate to use the word, but I think there's a maturity to what they're doing this close season. So the signings that we've made so far look thought about, they look planned. They've wanted to fill certain targets and they've gone out and got that. I'm not sure that we really needed another goalkeeper, but hey, if the 6'8" Carlos Miguel is as agile as everybody talks about him being, then why not? We've clearly had a problem last year with set pieces and clearing the ball. So if you've got a 6'8" goalkeeper and you bring in a Serbian experienced international defender who's whatever he is, 6'2" or 6'4" or something, with unbelievable stats across the Italian football for the last 3 or 4 years in terms of his heading ability and clearing the ball, then they've clearly addressed that need, and vital to get them in pre-season. But it just seems that everything is a bit more measured and therefore a bit more mature. It's almost that we've had the excitement of the first 2 years. I don't think this year will be any less exciting, but I'm hoping for positive excitement, not negative excitement. We've clearly dealt with PSR, so that's not going to be an issue over the next season. So, I'm pretty excited, actually. I was talking to some people yesterday. I'm pretty excited about how the 24-25 season is coming together. I think we just need to be realistic about where we came from. When we won the Championship playoff final, to that first game of the season away at Newcastle is the shortest period of time any club ever has had to prepare for coming into the Premier League. Plus, we'd not been in the Premier League for 23 years. And
we had so many loan players.
Yeah, but also, we had to bring in those 22 players at that time, because as I keep saying to people until I'm blue in the face, there were only 4 of that Championship winning side who could play in the Premier League, and there's only one of them still at the club. Well, if you assume that Worrell's going to go, there's only Ryan Yates still at the club. So everything about the club on the pitch has had to be rebuilt.
So next question that came to us on social media was, can you see Sangare playing a crucial part in the side next season, or will he be the biggest flop ever? Which is maybe a little bit harsh, but given Sangare's performances last season, the fans, he didn't really have that connection. But let's not forget that he was a player that came in and had to settle in and everything like that. David, what do you think about that? And I think you caught quite a bit of it. You were telling me before we recorded this about the Chesterfield game. He looked really bright in that. Yes, it's Chesterfield. Yes, it's a pre-season. We discussed this on the last podcast, but he looks sharp and he looks ready to go, and he looks he almost looks the player we've bought for that amount of money.
Well, he just looks leaner, doesn't he? So I'd love to see his weights and his fitness markers that they do pre-season and when they got him in. He looks noticeably leaner. He looks noticeably sharper on the ball in those terms of those little turns that you want from your number 6 to just get themselves out of trouble and to find that space. He looks, if you watch back, he was the pass before the pass in both goals, other than the one that he obviously scored himself. So I'm going to pick Sangare to be the player of the year for Nottingham Forest. I reckon he looks really good. He looked really good. You heard it here first, Max. And the tickets are on the tape. Let's see.
Clip that up. Steve, do you agree there, or do you think Sangare could become a little bit of a flop?
You and I have talked about this before on the pods. I've been and lived and worked abroad, and to go and live and work abroad is not easy, irrespective of who you are, how much you're paid, what infrastructure there is around you. So to get a guy to come in at the beginning of the season who has to uproot himself, his family and everything else, that's not an easy thing to do. He was then deliberately played out of position because they didn't want to expose him at the back and therefore cause more problems. Then he disappeared off to the Africa's Cup. And I heard, and I don't know if this is true, but a number of people have mentioned this, that when he came back from that, he had malaria. If anyone's ever met anybody who's had malaria, there's no way you're going to perform as a professional sports person when you've got an illness like that. So for me, you've got to write off the whole of last season, unfortunately. He's now going to get pre-season. I think, as David says, he looks sharper, he looks leaner. I wasn't at the Chesterfield game, but I've seen some of the clips. When you're paying 35 million or whatever it was for somebody like that, you have to do your research. He wasn't one of those, last minute, we fancy him, we'll stack up a load of cash and bring him in. So I see him being a real key component of the team going forward.
Yeah, fingers crossed. And interesting that, Steve. And I agree. I think, for a player that has to come and settle into a brand new country, it isn't easy. And we've seen before, we've seen plenty of times with Forest. It just takes a little bit of time for players to almost embed themselves into the squad, the club, and really almost buy into maybe even the coaching style of a new manager with Nuno. David, this one then, which leads us quite nicely, mentioning Nuno, expected formation next season. Will we see a possible return to Nuno's old shape with three at the back like he had at Wolves? And it's an interesting one, that. How do you see that going?
Well, it looked good in the three against Chesterfield, I thought. I think a lot of it is going to come down to the performance of Nico Williams and Ola Aina as the wingbacks. I think that might also be telling in terms of how much we can get out of them in the up and downs. It wouldn't surprise me. Managers typically go back to what they know. And so we've seen it before. I think you're going to see him go back to that formation, what with Willy Bolly in the centre. And I expect we'll have Murillo on the left and, Milenkovic on the right as the right-footed right centre-back. Wouldn't surprise me. So I'd say yes.
Talking to Milenkovic, actually, we've done a whole podcast. We're going to do some more in the next few weeks about him. But as someone that actually followed the Euros quite closely, I don't know if you were there for England's game. Were you against Serbia? Yeah. What did you make of Milenkovic? Good player?
Absolutely honest answer is I've no idea, because I was focusing on England and I didn't realise at the time that we were in for him. Otherwise, I would have taken a look. I mean, England in that game did a classic, scored early, sat back. But I'm a great believer, that there aren't any mug sides anymore, really. Certainly not when you get to the Euros. And the great thing about Eastern European sides, or used to be called Eastern European, now Central European sides, is there's an absolute passion to play for the team and play for the shirt. So I don't remember much about him, but I remember that they were difficult to get through, and he would have been a key part of that. So we've gone out and we've targeted him. And if you look at his Opta stats or whatever else, they are really, really good for what we need in that position. So it strikes me as a really sensible and proper piece of business.
From the numbers, he's the starter from what I don't watch much Serie A, I must confess, but I went down the rabbit hole of researching him. And he's played multiple seasons as a starter for Fiorentina, who have been, a mid-table Italian Serie A side, and he's a mainstay in the Serbian backline. And so I ask you this question: do you think Niakate would make that Serbian team? And I'd say probably not ahead of Milenkovic. And given that the dollars that were on Niakate and what we got him in for, you'd have to say it's an absolutely terrific piece of business if we can pull it off and he's as strong as we're expecting and hoping to be. He's tall. He can grab a couple of goals off some set pieces. He's got good leadership. Great signing.
Right, next one. Adrian asks, will the stadium ever be extended realistically? Obviously, Forest have pretty much sorted it out with the council. There's a few little things to announce. I mean, it's not for definite, but it looks like Forest are going to stay at the City Ground, and then all the talk about planning permission for building on the City Ground starts. But Steve, I guess this is a bit of an interesting one for you to answer, as being someone that's part of the supporters trust on the board there. You've almost followed the situation quite closely with Forest, expanding the stadium. What do you think? And it is something that the club will have to evaluate, isn't it? In the next few years, is to almost when they, if they start this building work, when do they start it, and just consulting with the fans, and it almost seems like it's the logistics that are stopping them doing it at the moment, really, and maybe the politics on the side with it all.
I mean, I think the priority is to get the issue sorted out with the council and acquire the freehold of the land so that the club are in control of that. I don't think that means that there's an absolute guarantee that we will always be at the City Ground forever, but you can never, ever expect that. Although I think it is a strong preference, and the council, having done what they've done, allows that opportunity. I do think that money will be spent on the stadium. Nothing's going to happen this season, so we're going to be looking at sometime next summer now. Whether the Take That concert, for example, was a great success and must have brought in a lot of revenue. You'll know, Max, you were there. Saw you in the stands, dancing away. That put a smile on everyone's face.
Yeah. See, how can I be negative when I'm at Take That singing away?
There you go. You see,
I think Take That are old, Steve. He thinks they're like a retro band from before he was born.
and I think maybe that's one way that the club want to go, isn't it? Because it's a great source of revenue. So whether that means on the, whatever it is, 20th of May next season, they start knocking things about, or, it's delayed by a couple of months because there's some summer events, I don't know. But I would anticipate that their mindset will be, if they can sort this out and they can get the planning permission agreed, which you'd presume comes with buying the freehold, and it's all part of that overall discussion, that let's hope we can start to see some major change to the City Ground in the summer of 2025. And I guess then the difficulty is when you start that determines about when it'll be available, because it's going to be an 18-month process, isn't it, if we're talking about rebuilding the Peter Taylor stand, whether they do it as Liverpool have done their stands at Anfield, whereby you sort of convert the lower tier and then you build around the existing stand, and then you put the upper stand on the back of it, because one of the big issues will be revenue lost by not having all those fans in the ground. So that will be a consideration. But yeah, I do, and I'm not talking about this from any sort of insight from the trust or anything else, just the personal view. I do think they want it to happen, because clearly, let's be honest, everybody knows the ground is not fit for purpose. Even if you look at the Brian Clough stand, that was built in the early 80s. That's 40 years ago, for heaven's sake. The Trent End is what now, 26, 27 years old. And that's the most modern part of the ground, I'm thinking. It's, the whole ground really needs knocking down and starting again, but that's never ever going to happen, and that's not possible unless you do something like a Spurs. But we're not going to want to play at Notts County for the next 2 or 3 years whilst we do that. So my expectation would be that back end of summer 2025, then we start to see some major changes to the ground.
Question for you: how many non-Premier League teams have a capacity of 40,000 or more? None. If we can build the stadium up, it's such a big tell, and it would be such a big moment for Nottingham Forest, that the couple of years that we might have away from the City Ground, I just think would make it worthwhile. And I know from me personally, having just visited the City Ground recently, I was spending big bucks to travel into Nottingham. I'm staying at a hotel. I'm spending big money on lunch, dinner, going down to the ground, buying a whole bunch of merch and stuff. We have 10,000 extra seats, 2,000 of which can be David Boldeman type characters visiting. That's a pretty serious amount of money for Nottingham that we want to be able to bring to that region. And so we've got to be pushing for the extra 10,000 seats. And you're right, in terms of the tech, having been to a lot of the American stadiums, and we'll see it with the World Cup in 2 years' time, those NFL stadiums, they are just state of the art. And so we're a fair bit way off that. But if you look at, the Marinakis regime, they are ambitious. And so they are going to find a way to lift the quality of the stadium so that we're not complaining about the pricing of the tickets. We're saying, yeah, we're kind of feeling good about it because the Wi-Fi works and the toilets are good and there's hot water and there's all the other good stuff that we think that we should have.
Right. Lastly, on to the next last question, really. And I thought I'd leave this till last because just as we were about to record this, David brought up a very good point about, as a fan that's living abroad or, you know, an international fan, almost asking what the purpose of the Forest Trust is, which we'll get onto in a moment. But this question links nicely in from Alex, who asks, in terms of the relationship with the fans, the trust and the club, as price increases, £10 for a waiting list with none of the members getting that have paid for this season ticket, reducing the groups, you know, the huge spike in prices for the season tickets, as we all know. And he really asks, what's the relationship going to be like this season between the fans and the club, which is almost a little bit, I guess, where the trust comes into. Steve, do you want to take that up first? And then almost maybe as well, give a bit of an explanation from a trust point of view of what the trust is for David, what they can do for the fans, even living internationally, and how they will almost improve that relationship between the fans and the club this season.
So the trust were formed in 2017 on the back of what was happening with Fawaz. And it was created because lots of people were clearly very upset with the way the club was going, the way it was being handled, the way it was being managed. And you may remember there were protests outside the ground and there was lots and lots of disquiet. And the trust was formed, and it was only I think it was the third trust in the country to establish a memorandum of understanding with the club, the first having been Fulham. And I remember going down to Fulham to meet both the exec and the trust in order to understand quite what that meant. And I was part of the board in 2017 when it first set up. And we established that, and we established a relationship with the club. I've always felt, and I've said this in many quarters, that the role of the trust is to be a critical friend. And I think people see the trust as it should be a critical friend. There were various things happened around 17, 18 and into 19, which prevented or didn't allow the trust to be perhaps as strong as it wanted to be or needed to be or could have been. And I felt that was disappointing. And again, it's on record. I resigned from the trust in 2019 because there wasn't that opportunity to have those levels of discussions with the club, really at any level. And I personally didn't feel, I mean, David's not aware, I don't live in Nottingham. I live about 60 miles away. So sort of traveling over to go and, you know, trying to have those conversations. I became a bit disillusioned about it. The trust then has really been run by a couple of people, and they've done a fantastic job in maintaining it and making sure that it is still there. And that's the current chair, Andy Cadell, and the guy who pulls all the strings behind the scenes, which is Paul Seven. In the back end of last year, the club, at the request of the Premier League, and all Premier League clubs are expected to have one, set up or was planning to set up a fans advisory board, and automatically invited the trust and 5 other groups to be part of that fans advisory board, and also invited applications for 2 independent members. I expressed an interest in that. That didn't happen, and I understand the reasons why. But I'd always maintained a conversation with Andy and with Paul, and spoke to them about potentially rejoining the trust, and did so in January of this year, along with 5 or 6 other people. And the board of the trust now is much stronger. There's some fantastic experience around that table. I mean, you interviewed Robert, Max, in terms of his very, very specific and detailed knowledge around football finance and PSR and FFP. And that put the trust in a very strong position with the club as an advisory body, which is what the trust should be, I think, and what the trust wants to be with the club. The trust has a good relationship with the club. There is a constant dialogue between lots of members of the trust and lots of other aspects of the club. It's not just about the men's team. It's also about dialogue about the women's team. It's about facilities. And then we come on to some specifics this year. We as the trust did a whole lot of work with our members. So we went out to our members about, look, Arsenal and Spurs have started to put price increases in. They've started to play with the concessions. What are your views? The feedback that we got from that, we submitted to the club, and this is on record. It was ignored, and the club then imposed the price increases that they did for season cards. And the most telling one of that is if somebody who was 18 last season sat in the middle of the Brian Clough or Peter Taylor stand, who was paying last season, was paying £190 for their season ticket. Next year, they're going to have to pay 850 quid to sit in exactly the same seat, because A, the price has gone up, and B, the concession range has gone from, if I get it right, 12 to 18 down to 13 to 17. They've also removed, which hasn't had a lot of publicity, once you become 65, it's no longer an automatic concession to get a senior ticket. The small print that came out says that that's now 66, which is in line with, UK pension age, which is understandable, but it wasn't sort of publicised. So there was lots of disquiet around the whole sort of ticket pricing issue, and ultimately the club are not going to move, but they did apply some minor concessions. So if you're a senior card holder now, you get 2 women's games for free. You get the pre-season friendly for free, which is presumably going to be the Friday fixture against Valencia. You get discount at the shop, although not on shirts, but other merchandise. And there's a couple of other things, I can't remember what they are, but it was some minor concessions. But there was later an acknowledgement from the club that the way those prices had been imposed was wrong. We have members all over the UK and internationally, so there's no reason, David, why you couldn't be a member. Realistically, if you're a member from overseas, what's that going to mean? It means you can get your view in on surveys. You can communicate with the trust at any time and get that view into the club. The trust could have done more and acknowledges that it could have done more for the members. But now that there is the resource around the board, instead of there just being sort of 2 people trying to deal with everything, there's 10, 12 people trying to deal with much more. That you will see more activity. So, for example, we're hoping to put on an event sometime in September for members at the City Ground, which will be, if we can get that off the ground, we'll be inviting members to the City Ground. Come and meet other members. Perhaps there'll be an interview with a member of the sort of backroom staff at the club, and maybe even a player, and hopefully one of the women's players as well, so that we get that proper inclusion that there should be. So going forward, there is lots of optimism around the trust board about what we can do and how we can do it, and an understanding that if the club makes a decision that the fans don't agree with, that we need to comment on that. It needs to be constructive, because we've always got to make sure that we have that dialogue. But there is an increasing relationship with the club, and times when the club, which everybody won't know about, is coming to the trust and going, we're thinking of doing this, how does that stack up? Now, that sort of conversation doesn't become public and never will become public, and everybody will understand that. But there is that relationship, there is that dialogue. We as the trust would like to increase our membership. The more people that we can represent, the stronger the voice that we can have. But we absolutely recognise that in order to do that, we need to be doing things for our members. We're building up an increasingly strong relationship with the Football Supporters Association and therefore the Premier League. So that's allowing us to have direct dialogue with the Premier League. There's a very strong relationship with the women's team. And you'll see some developments over the next few months where part of the trust board and membership will be focused on the women's team. There's work that Vicky Connell's doing on the board about support for women or female supporters of the men's team. And we want to be absolutely fully inclusive. So anybody who wants to join, anybody who wants to come along, get involved, you'll be made very, very welcome. And that's how it'll happen going forward. But from a personal point of view, I've real optimism about the role of the trust going forward and being able to fill the role that probably its members, who we represent, and the broader fan base would like us to provide, rather than as it perhaps got involved in the early days. So hopefully that gives us sort of a, an introduction and a bit of an insight. And I look forward to signing you up, David.
I'll sign up straight after this. I like the vision statement or the mission you have of being the critical friend, I think is the appropriate language. Look, I'll just respond to what I just heard there, if I may. The ticket price increase, if you go to a coffee shop and your coffee is now £2 instead of £1 or it's gone up, everyone's always grumpy when the price of stuff goes up, and there's no easy way to tell people that you're going to suddenly charge them more. So I feel that was difficult for the club. But geez, that 180 to 850 sounds like it's a lot, so I can understand the grievances there. From an international perspective and a fan coming in, I would ask that the tickets for international fans that come in months out, so my next visit to Nottingham Forest will be planned 12 months in the making. And so being able to guarantee that on the 20th of April in 2025 that I know that I can definitely get a Nottingham Forest ticket, it's just so much more important to me than it is to anyone else who might be coming, if you're traveling halfway around the world. So finding a solution for that would be helpful. And in many ways, having more expensive tickets actually does do that for the international fan, because if the tickets are more expensive, then there's more available on the resale market. But yeah, it's a terrific job that you guys do, and you can tell the impact, and you can tell that the club is listening, because they did kind of bungle that price increase a little bit, and those concessions are a great piece of work. So thanks for the support for the fans, and I look forward to becoming a member and getting involved.
Yeah, thanks, David. I mean, it's interesting that here we are, about a month out from the start of the season. There's still not yet been any announcement on away memberships. There's not been any announcement on individual ticket prices. And despite the comment that I think your questioner made earlier, Max, some of the people on that waiting list have indeed been offered season tickets. Now, everybody knows that there was the number of, there are 10,000 now on the waiting list. I mean, that wasn't a decision by those 10,000 people to go onto the waiting list. It was an automatic capture of data off one website transferred onto another data list, because they were all people who at some stage had bought a ticket or were Forest members or My Forest members or whatever the various categories of the home memberships. So they automatically got transferred over to that list. The club recognised that sending out a tweet at 11:50 in the evening to say, oh, there's now 11,000 on that list, so basically unless you renew your season ticket, we're going to sell it somewhere else, was an error of judgment. They've recognised that. There was a lot of tension around that time, but as a trust, we've tried to navigate our way through and help. We represent our members, that first of all, but we want to represent also, as part of that, the wider fan base. But we're limited in terms of, the resource that we have. We are all volunteers. Nobody's paying anybody to do what we do. We're doing it for the passion and the love of the club, but also because there are some things that we think could be done better, and we want to be able to articulate that into the club. And the club does listen, and the club does engage. Ultimately, the club make the decisions. So, we can't tell them what to do. We can ask and invite them what to do, but we do have that dialogue. And there are a number of other things going forward where we know that there's going to be dialogue with the club. And we're looking forward to that. And we know from the reception from the club that the club are looking forward to that. And so the more members that we can get and be able to represent, in a sense, the stronger our voice can be, because we can represent more people. We've just done a member survey and got a nearly 35, nearly 40% return rate on that survey. And the key bit of information in there was that the vast majority of people don't want to move away from the City Ground. And that information was presented to the club. And I think they were perhaps surprised about the strength of feeling, but it certainly will have had an impact with a few people. Ultimately, football is a business. And therefore, in a sense, we've got to get to that 40,000 in order to be competitive. But we're never, even at 40,000, we're going to have to be very creative in some of the deals that we're going to do to compete with the top six. And we could have a whole podcast about the top six and everything else. In 25, 26, there will be a bit of a salary cap, but it's judged by a relationship to salary between salary and turnover. So if you're a Man City with a turnover of 550 million, you can spend 400 million on salaries. If you're Forest with turnover 150 million, you can only spend 110 million on salaries. That's not a fair playing field. And it doesn't even
hold the Premier League back.
Yeah, and it just doesn't, just doesn't allow competition. So there's all these conversations in place, but the more members we can represent, the stronger the voice can be.
When we interviewed Andy Cadell from the Supporters Trust, as Steve eloquently mentioned there, I'd highly recommend you go and listen to my interview with him. We did it, I think, a couple of months ago now after Forest and the season ticket debacle, and he gave some really interesting actually answers. And what we did is we were live on Facebook and YouTube, and we opened it up to questions, and there were quite critical questions at times, and Andy answered them very well. I'd highly recommend you go and watch it.
Yeah.
And I also think, just to throw it into the mix, a bit of communication would be better from the club, especially during the season ticket kind of price debacle. They went so quiet, and then they did one interview with one podcast and then refused interviews from the BBC for many other media broadcasters, and it was just all a bit quiet. Why not? Did the club not come out then at that point and almost explain their reasoning? And probably fans would have not taken a liking to it, but certainly maybe understood their actions for it, rather than just sitting quiet and then doing an interview 2 months later. So a bit more communication needed, I think. David, thank you. Steve,
pleasure.
Thank you very much. As always, if you did enjoy this episode, give us a like, share on YouTube, follow us across Spotify and Apple Podcasts, leave us a review. If you did enjoy it, we will see you next time from two positive older fans and one positive young fan. See you later. Bye-bye.